All right, so let me say a welcome to our panelists who have already joined. I need to do a little bit quick what introduction or talking point to the program, then we'll jump into the program very soon. So hello and welcome to our listeners across the African diaspora and the African continent, especially those on the various social media platform.
Get
This
close to the microphone.
all right. Is it okay?
Somehow.
All right. So this is Sankofa African Affairs Global Program, which is organized by Berlin Associate Consulting Limited. My name is Benjamin Akwe. I'm the host for today's program. It's 9:30 a.m. US Eastern Time, and it's 4:30 p.m. Southern African Time. Yeah, for those joining us for the first time, Sankofa African Webinar is a virtual discussion program that aims to bridge the gap between the African diaspora and the African continent. It's a platform that has the goal of bringing together experts from the African diaspora and the continent to discuss the contemporary issues facing the African continent. And most importantly, great powers, strategies, objectives, and relations with the African continent, since the African diaspora is considered to be the sixth region by the African Union Commission. Today's discussion topic, African Union's upcoming convention on elimination violence against women and girls, is a continuation of Sankofa's discussion series on gender-based violence in Africa. As the world approaches the 30th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, a resolution that was adopted by the UN at the end of the Fourth World Conference on Women in September 15, 1995, a review of the Platform for Action 3 strategies has shown that violence against women and girls remains alarmingly prevalent across private and public spaces and across all forms of violence against women and girls, including its most extreme manifestation through the gender-related killings of women and girls, which is referred to as femicide. So the African Union Commission, as part of the Beijing Declaration on the Platform for Actions on Ending Violence Against Women and Girls, will be holding a heads of state and government meeting in Addis Ababa to conclude negotiations and submit a draft convention for adoption in February 2025 of this year to establish a comprehensive legal binding framework for the prevention and elimination of an effective response to all forms of violence against women and girls across Africa by addressing the root causes and drivers of such violence, strengthening legal and institutional mechanisms, and promoting a culture of respect for human rights, gender equality, and the dignity of women and girls. It will also ensure that state parties reinforce a commonality of approach to eliminating violence against women and girls, whilst acting as a stimulus for an open narrative and advocacy on violence against women and girls, right? So this is the context in which we are trying to look at it. So on the African continent, there has been a rise in gender-based violence in terms of advocacy through sustained processes and strategies which have been adopted to influence ideas, decisions, or policies through the 2007 Maputo Protocol, right, on the African Declaration of Human and People's Rights on the Right of Women in Africa. And the 2009, since we are speaking within the context of Southern Africa, we are looking at SADC Protocol on Gender and Development, which was actually passed in 2009. So violence against women and girls form an important and critical aspect of the African Union Agenda 2063 goals and priority, which calls for the establishment of comprehensive legal binding framework, policy, and comprehensive strategies for the prevention and elimination of an effective response to all forms of violence against women and girls across Africa by addressing the root causes. So these are what the African Union is trying to do, right? And that is what we are also trying to actually analyze. So as a precursor to the African Union Heads of State and Government meeting in Addis Ababa this February, right? We at Berlin Associate Consulting Limited began a series of conversations on gender-based violence on the African continent. So for the past 4 weeks, we started with gender-based violence in West Africa, Then the week after, we look at gender-based violence in East Africa. Last week, we started looking at gender-based violence in Southern Africa. We started by trying to take a look at historical development of national laws, right? National laws, policies, and strategies in terms of women's rights. We started with women's rights, then we look at gender-based violence. We were very, very fortunate last week to have Sudi White, the Malawian White, who has been very, very influential in terms of women's rights and gender laws in Southern Africa. Right, so that is what we've been able to do last week. But today we want to continue with trying to trace the historical development of women's rights or laws, policies, and structure that has to do with women's rights and gender-based violence. So that's what is going to be in our contest today. So today we are fortunate to not only have experts and advocates to delve into national laws, comprehensive strategy, and policy for tackling all forms of violence against women and girls and gender-based violence across Southern Africa, but also we have a global mental health psychologist and trauma specialist within our midst today. She'll be joining us to try to put into historical context how colonization, right, could have played a role in terms of trauma, right, could have played a role in gender-based violence in Southern Africa, right? So let me take time to introduce our guest, right? So today we are having Miss Caroline. I think Caroline hasn't joined us yet. So let me introduce those who have joined us, then we'll move ahead. Caroline says she's having problems with her internet all the way in Malawi. She will try to fix it. And if she's able to fix it, she will join us. So let's try to introduce those who are already over here. We have Commissioner Jigu Kasendi, right, who is the Zimbabwe General Commissioner. He's joining us from Harare, Zimbabwe. Commissioner, did I get your name right?
Prof, that's very correct. It's Jigu Katande.
Okay, Jigu Katande. All right.
Yes.
Then we have Miss Advocate Larota. Is it Catlink? Who's a lawyer, right? She's an international human rights lawyer and gender-based violence expert and family lawyer. She is joining us from Masari in Lesotho. Did I get your name right?
Yes, Benjamin, it is Lerato Caroline Khutlang from Maseru, Lesotho.
Okay, thank you very much, right? Thank you for the corrections, right? So we will have Carlos Sokoto, who's a Black mental health advocate, right? And works for T32 Global Mental Health Fellow, right? She'll be joining us from Boston, right? She's a psychologist, right? Somebody who deals with trauma. So she will also try to bring into context how colonialism, especially when we look at Zimbabwe, we're trying to understand how the liberation movement, right, or during the course of liberation, some of the atrocities that were committed could have had some impact on gender-based violence on the African continent. So let me continue. To our guests, you are welcome to the Sankofa African Affairs webinar, where we discuss anything Africa. Let's take our welcome address from our guests as we delve into our discussion. So whilst we are waiting for Dr. Sokoto to join us, let's take our opening remarks. Let's go to you, Commissioner, first, right? Let's take probably like a 30 seconds or 1 minute opening remarks from you. Then we'll go to Loretta. Commissioner, let's take your opening remarks briefly.
Thank you, Prof. First, allow me to maybe start by sharing with you what I have here from the Zimbabwe Gender Commission. I'm not sure, am I able to share with you what I have with
Commissioner, we would like you to give us your opening remarks first, right? Then when we get into the conversation, then we can take what you have for us. Just your opening remarks for now.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Basically, I'm coming in from the Zimbabwe Gender Commission, and my understanding of the meeting here is that we want to look at the national laws as to how they pertain to gender-based violence involving women and girls. So we are also going to focus on the policies that we have as a country here in Zimbabwe, and also the strategies that we think are relevant or that we think we are using here in Zimbabwe to curb gender-based violence. So basically, that's what we'll be focusing on. And I think as a country, we are doing a lot, we are doing enough, although it may not be enough, but I think we are in the right path.
Okay, all right. So yeah, thank you very much for the brief conversation. We'll get into the discussions where you have the opportunity to show us what you have been doing in terms of policies, national laws and strategies later on. But we just want to take our opening remarks from our guests. Then we'll jump into the conversation. Okay, right.
Thank you, Prof.
Yeah, let's go to the advocate, right? Is it Caroline? Can you give us your opening remarks briefly?
Thank you very much, Benjamin. Platforms like this one usually remind me of the words of a wise man who once said that gender-based violence is not a fight that we fight in silos, but one that requires collaborative efforts from different stakeholders. So I'm really honored to be here, and I'm looking forward to sharing insights from Lesotho. And I hope the insights of the Lesotho jurisdiction will help other colleagues to learn more of our legal status as a nation. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Right, I think the other Caroline from Malawi is still having problems joining us, right? But we can still proceed whilst we wait for our other guests, right? So we want to remind our listeners that Sankofa African Webinar relies on narratives for its discussion programs. Narratives are an integral part of African societies, and in our discussions, we utilize them based on research, policy findings, and policy positions, and realities prevailing in various African countries. The narratives help our panelists to present their perspective independently, which sometimes may diverge from official government or organizational policy positions and doctrines. The discussions are also anchored on a myriad of perspectives, so there may be differences in opinions of our guests based on their expertise, their knowledge, and experiences. The difference in opinions does not necessarily mean perspectives and thoughts shared are wrong, but reflect a divergence of ideas to address security challenges on the African continent. Right. So I want us to begin, right, whilst we are waiting for Dr. Sokoto to join us. I want to start with you, right? Because what we are trying to look at today, Commissioner, what we are trying to look at today is gender-based violence, right, in Southern Africa. But what the African Union, right, heads of state and government will be taking a look at in February in Addis Ababa has to do with violence against women and girls, right? So for us to be on the same page, right, in terms of our discussion today, right, I want you, right, to give us what a differentiation between what is violence against women and girls and what is gender-based violence. What are the differences between these two? Can you explain the distinction? Because it is very, very important. Take into consideration what Zimbabwe 2023-2030 national strategy to prevent and address gender-based violence. Can you try to draw the distinction between what gender-based violence is and what the African Union is trying to do in terms of crafting a comprehensive legal framework that will address violence against women and girls? Can you try to draw the distinction between these two, violence against women and girls and gender-based violence? Commissioner.
Thank you, Prof. I think we need to start by saying, what is our understanding of gender-based violence? Then we focus on violence against women and girls. So let's start with gender-based, our understanding of gender-based violence. We are saying gender-based violence, it is that type of violence which is directed to any person, whether male or female, mainly because of their gender. It's a violence targeted at a particular person because of their gender. That's gender-based violence. You may be a man and there's violence being targeted, violence targeting you from either women or so, or you may be a woman and violence being targeted to you. That is what we call gender-based violence. And when we talk about violence against women and girls, we are now being more specific. We are now being more specific. We are now focusing specifically on that violence which targets women and girls. And in our society, it's very rampant. Here in Zimbabwe, it's also rampant, and it's there. But in fact, violence against women is part of gender-based violence. It's part of our traditional practices, customary practices. We take it as normal. In most societies, even here in Zimbabwe, gender-based violence as it targets women, it may not be taken seriously. It's not taken seriously by both the authorities and those in position of power to stop it, because it is regarded as part of our tradition. Let me give an example of, say, an elderly man is allowed to play maybe sexually with a young woman, with a young girl, say 12, 10, 9 years, because our tradition says such men are allowed to do that in relationships. So that's the type of violence against women we are talking about. And it's there. Violence against women, even say child marriages. Child marriages targeting specifically young girls only. Female gender mutilation targeting young girls again. So we are talking about violence against women where we are specifically focusing on that type of violence, which specifically targets women only. And you are saying society seems to tolerate such views. Society seems to tolerate such practices. Nothing much is being done. Nothing much is being done to curtail or to reduce such incidents. So yes, you are very correct to say heads of state are meeting to discuss such issues. Definitely, we need to continuously talk about violence against women and girls.
Okay, thank you for that close distinction, right? Lorenzo, do you agree with what the commissioner just said? Because we all want to be on the same page in terms of what the African Union is trying to do, which has to do with violence against women and girls, and the discussion that we are having. The discussion that we are having has to do with gender-based violence. So, do you agree with what the distinction that the commissioner has just done? Alex, somebody is, can you, yeah. Okay, Loretta, can you hear me?
Yes, Benjamin, may you please kindly mute there's somebody who's unmuted in the background.
Okay, yeah.
I have.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Yes, I totally agree with the commissioner. He has said it well that indeed gender-based violence affects all people regardless of their gender, but it's based on the gender. It's usually based on different power dynamics, and you'll see it more prevalent in patriarchal societies like the one that I come from. whereas the violence against women and girls is specifically geared towards women and girls, and it excludes other genders and other sex. So I wholeheartedly agree with him. And just to add on what he just said, there's also another important distinction: domestic violence, which people usually confuse with gender-based violence. So domestic violence is all those forms of violence, either gender-based violence or violence against women, but that take place within a domestic setting. It could be among relatives, or it could be among romantic partners, or whoever whom you're into an intimate partnership with.
Okay, let me just follow up, right? Given this distinction, right, some people hold the argument that if you try, it seems like we are trying to isolate, right, violence against women as a special category, or violence against women as victims, right? Because they tend to bear most of the brunt on violence. People make the argument that it seems like we are trying to give them that special treatment in terms of isolating them away from GBV. Commissioner, will you agree to that? Is it an isolation of women from GBV, then giving them that special character and treatment based on the fact that they bear the brunt of most of the violence against what?
Prof, I think we need to set the record straight by focusing on where we are coming from.
Okay.
We are saying we are coming from societies that are predominantly patriarchal in nature. And it's on record that women have been oppressed in several forms. They've been receiving various forms of violence in various forms. And now, when we are saying gender-based violence, we are trying to say, definitely we understand that there's violence targeting men, there's violence targeting women. And we also understand that even if societies are patriarchal, not all men are powerful. We have some men who are very weak, and they can also be targeted by women. But we are saying, in terms of numbers, in terms of the historical development of all this violence, it's women who has been at the receiving end. And therefore, when we say, let's focus on violence against women and girls, we are not trying to take to isolate them as a special group. No, we are saying, let's try to address this historical thing which has been there since time immemorial, but also taking into cognizance that there is also violence against men, because not all men are very strong. We also have some strong, we also have some weak men. In fact, let me go back to the issue that has been raised by our partner there, the issue of domestic violence. Yes, domestic violence is rampant even here in Zimbabwe, to an extent that by 2008, the government enacted laws and policies to curb domestic violence. But the laws are specifically very clear to say, when we say domestic violence, we are referring to violence even if it is perpetrated by a woman on a man. Even if it is perpetrated by a man on a woman, it's domestic violence. So we are not separating to say, if a man beats a woman, then it becomes domestic violence. But if a woman beats a man, then it's not domestic violence. No. We are saying any forms of violence must be eliminated. And therefore, our domestic violence is very clear. It outlines the various forms of domestic violence which happens in the domestic sphere, in the home. For example, physical abuse, psychological abuse, verbal, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, even stalking itself. Stalking itself is also a form of abuse. So there are various forms of abuse that are there in our domestic violence act, to say men and women should not commit such acts, because domestic violence has been criminalized here in Zimbabwe. It has been criminalized because of the numbers of men and women, although in terms of statistics, it's more women who go and report to the police. But yes, we are not denying the fact that men are also on the receiving end.
Okay.
So
All right. So now, okay,
my point is, we are not taking women as a special group, but we are trying to address the root cause.
Okay, thank you very much. Loretta, do you have anything to say briefly before we go into our conversations?
Thank you very much, Professor. Well, I wholeheartedly agree with the Commissioner, and I just want to highlight that there is a dire need for us to help women and girls separately, because studies have shown that in as much as gender does affect different gender, women and girls have turned to be more susceptible to gender-based violence. For instance, in Lesotho, at least 86% of Basotho women have experienced some form of gender-based violence in their lifetime. Now, isn't that alarming? And to make matters even worse, 47% of those women have been brutally murdered by their intimate partners. So that goes to show that, yes, it is true that we need to address all forms of GBV and all target groups, but women and girls are more vulnerable. Hence the need for us to perhaps focus on them while we are still addressing other genders, like members of the LGBTQ plus communities, because in recent studies we have also seen that they too tend to experience some form of gender-based violence. And speaking of the LGBTQ plus members, allow me to make an example of the recent case, a South African case, where a South African athlete, Caster Semenya, was banned from participating in the Olympics because her natural testosterone levels exceed those that are allowed in the Olympic Games. Now, this is quite unfair for her because those are her natural testosterone levels. So she's been discriminated on the basis of her gender. And that, for me, is tantamount to economical gender-based violence, because she yearns a living through athletics.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much. That is well noted, right? That's very, very important, right? So let's now delve into our conversation. So I've sent you the narratives in advance. So, Commissioner, the first narrative went to the narrative on human rights framing of gender-based violence. And it's about a forward that was presented in terms of the Zimbabwe National Strategy to Prevent and Address Gender-Based Violence 2023 to 2030. So that was the statement, the forward over there. Now, I want to give you a quick background to my question, then I'll give you the opportunity for you to do your presentation, right? So according to the Zimbabwe National Strategy to Prevent and Address Gender-Based Violence, GBV in Zimbabwe has become a pandemic and has been declared an emergency by the government. The government has a high prevalence, the country has a high prevalence of GBV, with 1 in 3 females having a lifetime of experience of GBV. The phenomenon is widespread, occurring across all socio-economic, cultural backgrounds and regions of the country. GBV is rooted in gender inequality, the abuse of power and harmful norms. Despite having a progressive legal and policy framework, national policies and strategies such as, right, so Zimbabwe has all these policies. Now, I want you to walk us through these laws and these policies and these strategies first before I pose my question to you. Right. So Zimbabwe has all these laws, these policies and strategies. So I wanted you to walk us through these laws, policies and strategies. Then after you are done with your presentation, I can go ahead and ask my question.
Thank you, Prof. I'm coming in from the Zimbabwe Gender Commission, one of the institutions created by government specifically to deal with gender. And therefore, allow me to share with you briefly part of the things that we are doing to work in the area of gender-based violence.
Thank you.
So the government, through Parliament, having recognized that gender has become gender-based violence has become an endemic issue, they set up the Zimbabwe Gender Commission, whose mandate is, as you can see from what I'm sharing there, to monitor issues concerning gender equality, to investigate possible violations of rights, to receive and consider complaints from the public with regards to gender-based violence, to conduct even the research itself, to advise public and private institutions, to recommend affirmative action programs to achieve gender equality, to recommend prosecution for criminal violations of rights, and to secure appropriate redress where necessary, but mainly to do everything necessary to promote gender equality. So as a commission, we understand all the various forms of gender, of GBV, the physical aspect, the emotional aspect, the economic aspect, and the social aspect. And as you have said, that women and girls are disproportionately affected by GBV to an extent that 1 in 3 women have experienced either physical or sexual intimate partner violation in their lifetime. So those are the impact of GBV. As a commission, we appreciate the impact, and therefore we understand that our work is very important. Even in terms of social costs. So in terms of the legal and policy framework that we want us to focus on, we start with the Constitution of Zimbabwe. If you go to section 25 of the Constitution, it provides for the protection of the family from domestic violence. Section 26, it requires to take the state itself to take measures to ensure that children are not pledged in marriage. Section 51 acknowledges the right to human dignity. Section 52 ensures that the right to human personal security. Section 78 confers the right to found a family to persons at least 18 years. More importantly, I want us to focus on this one. That's the main issue here. Section 80 of the Constitution, subsection 3, it outlaws all laws, customs, traditions, and cultural practices that infringes the rights of women conferred to them through the Constitution. So specifically, the Marriage Act, it says only one can get married, men or women, when they're 18 years. So facilitating marriage for children under 18 years is a criminal offense in Zimbabwe. I have talked about the Domestic Violence Act already. We also have the statutory instrument number 2 of 2024, presidential powers, which makes it an offense for anyone to initiate or have any sexual or indecent relations with anyone under the age of 18 years. And for that, there is mandatory sentencing for rape, which is 10 years. Then we have the National Gender Policy. And in the National Gender Policy, there are some strategies there which are being put in place to make sure that we achieve or we try to eliminate GBV through adopting legislative, administrative, social, and economic measures. The National Gender Policy also has a specific focus on the eradication of child marriages, elimination of GBV in the workplace, and ending trafficking of persons. We also have the Disability Policy of 2021, and we have talked about already the Zimbabwe National Strategy to prevent and address GBV. So basically, Prof, that's what we are focusing on.
All right, so you've given us a broad background, right, in terms of historical context, what has been done, right? What you presented, I also have a list of them over here. Now, Despite all these national policies and strategies and concerted efforts of government, developmental partners, civil society organizations, and communities to addressing GBV in Zimbabwe, why is it that there is still the prevalence of gender-based violence in Zimbabwe? Why is it so high and remain unacceptably high and is being considered to be a pandemic and has been declared as a national emergency by the government? Despite all these laws, despite all these policies, and despite all these strategies, why is Zimbabwe still experiencing this high rate of GBV in the country? What contributes to that?
Yes, Prof. Thanks very much. Allow me to go back to my previous presentation where I was talking about the nature of our societies, the patriarchal nature of our societies. In as much as the Commission and other arms of government, civil society, faith-based organizations are working towards trying to educate people and trying to reduce GBV, but this patriarchal behavior, you see, I'm talking about change of behavior. Our cultural norms, our traditional practices. In fact, as a commission, have recognized that our cultural practices and traditional norms have a larger bearing on GBV. We have now roped in traditional leaders. So what are we doing? We are saying traditional leaders as custodians of our tradition and culture. They have to take part in GBV. So we are training them, we are educating them, these traditional leaders, to say, you are the ones who are there in the communities. Let's talk with our people. GBV should be eradicated. So the first one is to engage traditional leaders. Secondly, we have also found that it is also important to engage even faith-based organizations, because part of GBV is being meted out to women in the name of religion, in the name of religion. For example, the issue of child marriages. There are some traditional apostolic sects where elders in the church can claim that they have dreamt, and therefore having dreamt, they are then given this young girl who is 8 years or 7 years as a wife. So we are trying again to eradicate such practices through, yes, I understand your concern that even the government has said this one is a national disaster, but yes, even if, through that declaration, it gave us powers now to say, let's go into the communities. Let's go and find out the lived realities of these people. What is it that is happening there? So basically, that's the truth.
All right, thank you very much. Right, let me go to Loretta, who is more like a lawyer. Right, who is more a lawyer? I want your perspective. Now, if you look at the legislations, right, the national policies and the strategy that Zimbabwe has adopted, the Domestic Violence Act 2007, Sexual Offences Act 2002, the Administration of Estate Act 1997, Maintenance Act 1989, Matrimonial Causes Act 1987, then they have national policy and strategies, which he mentioned, right? People make the argument that most of these laws and policies and strategies are towards what? They are intervention. They are to intervene, but they are not to prevent. Will you agree with that assessment? That most of these things, these laws and policies and strategies are more interventionist, right? Instead of it being more of prevention. So the focus has been in intervening instead of preventing. Will you agree to that? Or will you come explain that to us based on what Zimbabwe has done so far?
Absolutely, Professor. I would definitely agree with that. And I'll also echo the commissioner's sentiment that we need to change the social behavior, because if we keep on promulgating these laws without eradicating the mentality or the mindset, then we will keep on responding instead of preventing. So you're absolutely right. we respond to the harm that has already occurred. But then if we were to change the perspectives of traditional leaders, like the commissioner has mentioned, or the faith leaders, then we'll be able to curb this forms of gender-based violence even before they manifest into reality. For instance, I marveled at the commissioner's presentation because Zimbabweans they have similar norms like us, Basotho. For instance, in Lesotho, the challenge that we encounter is that according to our customary law, we do not have the minimum age for marriage, but our customary laws allow a girl who has just reached puberty to get married. And we do know that people reach the puberty at different ages. I, for one, reached my adolescent stage I reached puberty at the age of 11. So meaning that by virtue of me being reaching puberty, then I was already ripe for marriage at the age of 11. So that conflicts with our statutory law, which is the Sexual Offences Act, because our Sexual Offences Act has made it clear who has the legal capacity to get into sexual activities. According to our Sexual Offences Act of 2003, any child below the age of 16 does not have the legal capacity to consent to sexual activities. So what is going to happen to that 11-year-old girl who was married under customary law simply because she reached puberty stage? Now it means that our laws are in conflict. So I wish our legislature or our lawmakers could see the dire need that we have for having harmony in these laws, because the perpetrator will come and defend himself lawfully and say that, no, I'm lawfully married to this 11-year-old, and it is my as a married man, I have a matrimonial right to have sexual activities with her. But then the statutory law on the other side does not allow the very same husband to engage in sexual activities with this girl. So it really, really is important for us to change the social behavior before we implement or promulgate this law, so that everybody sees the need to curb violence against women and girls. And to take this matter even further, in Lesotho, our customs are based predominantly on the primogeniture rule, meaning that a lawful heir in Lesotho is the first male child from the lawfully wedded wife. So meaning that our customs as a nation do allow patriarchy to prevail. So in as much as we may have laws that curb patriarchy or the primogeniture rule, before we change the mindset of the traditional leaders, we will never fully eradicate gender-based violence. So yes, I do agree with that statement that yes, the laws that we have, they respond to GBV instead of preventing it.
All right, thank you very much. Right now, Dr. Sokoto has just joined us. Dr. Sokoto, if you listen to Loretta very carefully, she raised the issue of patriarchy and culture. Right now, you are a Kenyan and you live in the United States. Right, there's patriarchy in every society, whether it's a Western society or it is an African society. Culturally, it exists everywhere. Why is it that in Africa we tend to dwell so much on this aspect of our culture, and we make the argument that that is the reason why GBV is prevalent in our societies? Because we have the same thing in the United States, right? We live in a patriarchal society. Men dominate in every aspect of American life, right? So what is your take on using culture as an argument?
Hi, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where everyone is. Thank you for the introduction. So my name is Carlo, and my capacity here, I'm speaking as a psychologist. I'm Kenyan by origin, but I do live in the US, like Dr. Benjamin has said. Yeah, and I appreciate all this, the context that we've been provided here. So why do we use culture as a to explain gender-based violence? That's a good question.
Yeah, I'm saying that because in the United States where you live, right, we have that kind of patriarchy society where
Yeah.
men dominate. If you look in terms of even what wages, right, we say what for every dollar that a man receives, a woman receives 79 cents, right? So that means these power relations exist in the United States. So why are we using that as what an argument, a cultural argument?
I think one of the reasons that we do use that, honestly, is because I think it's imperialism and our history speaks to the language. I think the language that we use as Africans to explain most of our problems, unfortunately, it is language that has been fed to us or has been given to us through different means. For the longest time, we have not it's not that we don't have the capacity, but we have not had, because of all the different influences that continue to influence our, just our existence as countries, we have always been subject to neo-colonialism, essentially. So we are independent nations, but the language and the words and the terminologies to explain our realities, unfortunately, have often been determined from a very Eurocentric perspective. So, and this is because of funding and economic issues. And I want to say that it is understandable because at the end of the day, we are developing countries, and unfortunately, we are very reliant on donor funding and aid, and there's so much iniquity in regards to our existence as independent countries that it does not only impact infrastructure or education, it also impacts language and how we explain our problems. And I actually think that using culture as an explanation for such pervasive and problematic and global issues like GBV is a global issue. And the fact that in Africa it's explained as culture, I think is an example of language that has been used in a way that it's an example of how we continue to explain things from a lens that is not necessarily our lens. And a good example that you've said is that patriarchy is here. It's in the US. It is prevalent in the US. It is prevalent. We can use examples even when we think about the national presidential debates. You see patriarchy all over there. The fact that America, as a first world country, has still not yet even been able to hold a space for a female president. I mean, that in itself is patriarchy par excellence. And that Americans are not able to vote in a female president. So I think that, and then as a clinician, I work in a safety net hospital, which is equivalent to what we call public hospitals in Kenya or in most of Africa. Essentially, the patients that I see are the poorest and also all immigrants, people who don't have insurance. Specifically, my specialty is trauma. So I treat PTSD. And let me tell you, gender-based violence is very prevalent in the US, okay? I see that every single time I'm in the clinic. So I think the language, so why is gender-based violence prevalent here too, and we do not say culture? And why do we explain how do we explain issues differently? So I think there's inequities in how we explain issues. My perspective around how gender-based violence is so prevalent globally, and this includes in Africa, is imperialism and capitalism. and
We-
the colonialism.
I'll come back to that since you joined us late. Let me go back to the commissioner, right? So, commissioner, would you agree, right, that most of these laws, right, and this policy and strategy have been more of intervention rather than be of prevention? Or if there are any prevention measures that you have not mentioned, can you share those preventive measures with us?
Thank you, Prof. Yes, before I respond to you, allow me to just briefly add on to what has been just said there concerning the issue of patriarchy. Prof, I want us to understand briefly the history of specifically Southern Africa. When we talk about patriarchy, being different from patriarchy in some other parts of the world, we are looking at Southern Africa as still being in the hands of traditional leaders who are our patriarchy. For example, here in Zimbabwe, traditional leaders are part of societal norms and governance of issues. Therefore, they advance patriarchal issues. There are even traditional leaders are on the payroll of government, which means the whole country is governed under traditional laws, which are highly patriarchal. So to say patriarchy in the other part of the world and the patriarchy in Southern Africa, therefore we are trying to use these words loosely, or we are trying to hide behind the finger. No, I don't agree. Patriarchy here in Africa is rooted traditionally in the hands of those who govern us, because they are the ones who govern us. For example, Prof, the whole village can be summoned to the chief or headman's court over a particular traditional issue, and no one disputes that, which is different from some other parts of the country. So here we want to look at the level of awareness, of gender-related issues that the other parts of the world have reached, and the level of awareness concerning GBV that we here in Southern Africa are still grappling with. So these two are different, Prof. So we do not to say, no, we are hiding behind in Africa. We use patriarchy as a small screen to say we do not do it to eradicate GBV. No. Now, coming back to your issue concerning whether we are having preventive or they are reactive laws. Again, the issue of patriarchy. You see, when we are crafting these laws, Prof, the laws are crafted in Parliament. Our parliaments, 90% of our parliamentarians are men. They are males. They are males. Even if the laws are very, very good, you see, I've heard a lot of people saying Zimbabwe has some of the most progressive laws in terms of domestic violence, in terms of supporting women, in terms of economic empowerment. But there's this issue of implementation. The issue of implementation. That is also where we are falling short. Patriarchy. Check again. Some of the issues to do with women and girls are not taken seriously by patriarchy. You go and report that my child is missing. The child is found at a certain businessman who has taken her in marriage in quotation. The law officers will say, before we even arrest this man, can you go back and talk in quotation? Go and talk. Agree on something. Because to them, any girl who has reached puberty can be taken away, despite the laws in the books to say this is what we want. And so there are so many challenges to the actual implementation of these laws. For example, here I'm thinking about Health services. Health services are not easily available to GB survivors, especially in remote locations of our rural areas. The survivors themselves, they have to look for transport. And in some cases, they are given even the transport by the perpetrator. And it dies a natural death. So yes, we are doing something, but we still have a long way to go.
Benjamin, you're on mute. We can't hear you.
I'm saying now that the word patriarchy from the cultural context now being contested. We may have this different interpretation of it. But Dr. Sokoto, do you have anything to share on that cultural word patriarchy?
Well, yeah, I wanted to just add, I think that Mr. I don't want to misrepresent the titles here. I just
He's
came.
He's a commissioner for the Gender Commission,
Yeah.
Commissioner for Gender Commission in Zimbabwe. Yeah.
All right. Mr. Katsande. Okay. Commissioner Katsande, I think that it's very important to contextualize our issues. I agree with that. And one of the reasons I think this conversation is so important is that these conversations that Sankofa is hosting is that it's a conversations where Africans talk about the things that are impacting them and how we are and our concerns around our context. The conversations by us for us, which I think is very important. So I want to be clear that I do support that. Regarding the language, one of the things that I want to highlight with language is that language says a lot. The words that we use to describe a problem, it says where it speaks to who is speaking, and also it speaks to who it's the issue is being, how the issue is being understood. I think patriarchy as a word to explain gender-based violence is very much accurate for us as Africans to be able to use patriarchy, because patriarchy captures that there's power dynamic. That's really what patriarchy is, the idea that someone is above another person. And in this case, patriarchy speaks to the male dominance and male being in preference to the female. My issue is when we use culture as a explanation. So for me, patriarchy and culture are two different terms. Culture devolves you from the responsibility from the idea of power. It doesn't speak, the word culture does not speak to the power dynamics in the relationship between the perpetrator and the person on the receiving end. And so that's my challenge. And my challenge is that historically, European and Eurocentric thought leaders have explained GBV in Africa as a cultural issue. And when you speak to an issue that is so prevalent and also very global as cultural, the implication is that it's beyond help. This is how these people are. That's the implication of such terminology. It's, we can just try and help, but this is how they were born. And historically, that's what they used, that's how they used to explain and to justify things like colonialism or even slavery in the US and other parts. It was these atrocities and a lot of times on the receiving end is people of African descent, has always been explained by such terminologies that imply that We were born into this kind of suffering. So essentially, when we explain gender-based violence using words like culture, I find it problematic from a historical aspect for that term. I do support the use of words like patriarchy because it speaks to it gives us direction as to what we are dealing with, and it names that it names the power dynamic, and it also allows it to be global because everybody knows that patriarchy is a global phenomenon and it is not unique to Africa. The other thing is that patriarchy also gives us a bigger context because who are the champions of patriarchy? The champions of patriarchy from a globalization concept is are Europeans. We don't talk about this a lot, but it is Victorianism, the idea of that a man is ideal and a woman is to be in the house and is to be cooking and to be taking care of homes. This is a Victorian conceptualization that has been globalized. Do Africans practice patriarchy? Yes, we do. But the way that culture is being used to explain gender-based violence on the continent, it implies that it is innate to Africans, and as if there is nothing that this is not that other non-African nations have not had a deep-seated practice of patriarchy. So for me, I think the language is so important in us explaining our problems, and I do think that patriarchy is an accurate terminology. And I am against culture because of how it has historically been used to imply that Africans are beyond help because this is just how they are.
Right, thank you. Let's go to Caroline, right? Caroline, you brought up the word patriarchy and culture, right? Can you let our viewers understand the way what people in Lesotho understand patriarchy within your cultural setting?
Thank you very much, Professor. I was a bit confused given that there are two Carolines in the panel.
Yeah, the other Caroline is not able to join, right? She's having internet issue. Go ahead.
All right, thank you very much, Professor. Well, where I come from, the word patriarchy is not just a term that is used loosely, it's even embedded in our law. Specifically, it's even embedded in our constitution. For instance, Lesotho is a constitutional monarch, and our king, who is the constitutional monarch, can only be a male because we use the primogeniture rule. So yes, I do agree with Doctor that culture doesn't play that much of a role, but unfortunately, where we come from, our laws are informed by the customs, by our norms at the crown. So yes, what was once a norm or what was once a culture can be eventually codified into legally binding laws. I'm going to make an example. An example would be in where I come from in Lesotho, children who are born out of wedlock are excluded from inheritance, and they are given discriminatory words like bastards or dogs. So that was initially a norm, but it was eventually codified into our laws of Lerotodi. Now it has become binding laws that legally speaking, a child who is born out of a marriage is called a bastard. In my local vernac, we call them sekhaupane, which loosely translates to a bastard. So yes, culture may not necessarily be that impactful in other jurisdictions, but that is subjective to different jurisdictions because laws, some countries make laws based on different influences. And for instance, like I said about the children who are born out of wedlock, yes, historically, given the old norms, there were it was lawful for us to discriminate against them using those insulting names. But after Lesotho ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Children and the protocol on the and the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, then Lesotho was compelled by these treaties to now promulgate or enact laws that will curb such discrimination against children. So now although historically it was allowed to name a child using derogatory names, now given the international treaties that Lesotho has ratified, you will literally get arrested for naming a child with an insulting name. So this is the case because of the international treaties we have ratified. Also, culture differs with time. As we progress, we change our norms. And in Latin, we say the boni mores, which means that the law aligns with the norms and the culture of the time. But that may not necessarily be the case in other jurisdictions. So to wrap up what I just said, so where a law that is based on culture conflicts with the statutory law, where customary law conflicts with the statutory law in my jurisdiction, statutory law usually prevails. So you will recall that at the inception of our discussion, I brought it to your attention that our customary law allows any child below the age of 16 to get married as long as they've reached the age of puberty. But now, later on, given the international treaties that I've just mentioned, the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child and the subsequent protocols thereon, now Lesotho is now compelled to curb child marriage. And historically, well, child marriage was quite prevalent, but now I'm pleased to share that right now there's only 24% of girls who get married before the age of 18. I know in some jurisdictions it can be something that is not necessarily worth celebrating, but given the historical context of Basotho, where child marriage was prevalent, it really, really is a milestone worth celebrating that right now we only have 24% of girls getting married before the age of 18. And thanks to the conventions such as the the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much. Right. So let's end this discussion, right? We are going to move to our next narrative, which is going to go to Dr. Sokoto. But before that, I want to ask the commissioner, I want to read something from the Zimbabwe Gender Commission, the Act. Then we'll proceed. The Act states somewhere that members of the Zimbabwe Gender Commission must be chosen for their integrity and their knowledge and understanding of gender issues in social, cultural, economic, and political spheres. And the genders must be equally represented on the commission. This is one of the requirements for somebody to be on the gender commission. Now, they use the word cultural, right? Now, what I want to understand from the commissioner, do you take into consideration historical antecedents, right? When you say the person should be have expertise in social, culture, and do you take into consideration historical antecedents in terms of how they will play a role in drafting these laws, these policies, and strategies?
Thank you, Prof. The Zimbabwe Gender Commission has 9 commissioners, of which 5 are females and 4 are males. Each one of the 9 is coming in with particular expertise, as you've just highlighted. And of the 9, 1 is specifically coming in as a chief. As a chief, the chiefs, they are part of the parliament. Since they are part of the parliament, they elect or select one of their own who comes in to the Zimbabwe Gender Commission to represent the cultural aspect. So that's the way how the Zimbabwe Gender Commission is staffed in terms of commissioners.
All right.
And definite, each one of them is an expert in a particular area.
All right.
Lawyers, educators, religious leaders, economists, in that order.
Okay, thank you very much. So that takes us to the next narrative, right? Which is based on framing mental health and the trauma into national policies and strategies to address GBV in post-conflict state. To some extent, most of African states or those in Southern Africa are said to be post-conflict states. Now, so Dr. Sokoto, I send a narrative to you, right? In terms of framing some of these legal laws, the policies and strategies. This is the question I want to ask. In our previous discussions, tracing the historical development of national laws, policies, and comprehensive strategies to address gender-based violence, we did not touch on the effects of colonization in framing discussion on gender-based violence. Can you speak to the possible ways colonialism may have impacted the collective mental health of Africans and how that potentially manifests or is related to gender-based violence and how that should be factored into framing national laws, policies, and strategies?
Yeah. Yeah, I do think that a lot of the work that we do around a lot about the gender-based violence context has historical pieces that sometimes can get lost in the conversation. So having looking at how we have been impacted by our history is so important, and it goes back to also when why terminologies like culture is are very are quite loose in explaining our issues, because it does not when we say things like culture, it does not capture our historical components like colonialism. Now, colonialism is a history that majority of Africans have faced, and psychologically, colonialism has impacted us directly to those who were there when it was happening, and indirectly to those of us who are alive now. And one of the things that a lot of scholars have identified as aspects of psychological impact of colonialism are in power structures and how we understand who. So there's a triangle, there's a colonialism triangle from a psychological aspect. And that is one, our idea of who is important and who is not important. So power, who is in power and who is not in power. Colonialism has impacted our concepts of that. Two, our knowledge, the idea of what is knowledge and what is worth being considered as knowledge. Colonialism has impacted our conceptualization of what information is important and whose information is important. And three, our identity, who we are and who we think we should be, has been impacted by the history of colonialism. And as a small example of that is, who we consider, and this is national, collectively as a people, who we consider someone that is important, or who we aspire to, who our role models are. It can be as simple as that. Who do we consider someone to aspire to? And these things are deep-seated in our social fabric and also in our subconscious. Some of it we might be aware of, but a lot of it is very deep-seated, and we can get into small examples of those. And so when we talk about how colonialism has impacted has participated or contributed to GBV, we do think about the concept that when we understand patriarchy, how we understand patriarchy is also a result of that, the power dynamics. Something that is that captures this topic very well is a conversation that was had between Nikki Giovanni, who is a Black female poet that passed away recently, and James Baldwin, who is a Black writer, a Black American writer. They have this 2-hour conversation. It's free. It's on YouTube, and I would suggest that I would recommend that too. They talk about how gender relations, they complicate gender relations from a systemic as well as an individual level. And a lot of times the gender-based violence and how how we conceptualize it is always is often dealt with from a very much individual level, because it is, it's impacting our lives and the lives of our loved ones. But one of the things that they challenge us to do is to expand it to the systemic as well as the individual level. So what is happening on the ground, the things that we've just been given examples of over here, impact of mental health, impact on education, and impact on family life. Those are important because that's what we are seeing. But these are the outcomes. These are the outcomes. And what your question is asking is what's the bigger picture? That is, what's the bigger picture? And so James Baldwin and Nikki Giovanni really give us a good framework of understanding and how these outcomes are framed with the bigger picture. And this is now where the history comes in, and also the social and political and economic context. How these things are rarely mentioned when we have this conversation, and yet they play such a key role in the outcomes that we are seeing with GBV. And I'll just give an example that they really dwell on. So they paint a picture, and this is a picture that they are painting in the 50s, okay, in a Black family, the gender-based violence that happens in a Black family, which is what happens in our African context, and the things that we are concerned with every day and up to today. So again, it paints a picture about the idea of this struggle being very global, but also very contextual. So they talk about how a Black woman and a Black man who are married are constantly having this back-to-back, but then it's always the woman that is on the receiving end of his anger and of his frustration, and that he can no longer be caring and loving to her and the children. And they talk about this. And then they go above that and say, but what is this man? What has this man had to face, outside of his home before he came in to become violent? What did he face outside of his home? And so James Baldwin paints a picture of what the Black man in America goes through, right? He's having to face racism, and this is in the 50s that he's talking about. So of course, that's the civil rights era, the racism and all that is happening in that time. He's not able to get a job because he's Black. And if he is, he's constantly being referred to in derogatory terms. And he's having to, contend with working for a white man. And all the things that were I'm trying to paint the social, the political, and the historical context that then is manifested in how the man shows up to his family. When we talk about the gender issues in our context, like the Commissioner Katsande and also our legal expert here, Lerato, they speaking there are a lot of things that they've mentioned are speaking to the context, the social, the economic, and the now you're asking about the historical context, right?
Yeah.
That are influencing what is going on, what the outcomes of GBV, and those are things that really need to be spoken to. So the historical, how colonialism impacts us is so important, because, you know, Ngugi wa Thiong'o talks about we're constantly decolonizing our minds, because we have been deeply impacted because colonialism introduced to us this concept of violence, which we have taken in different ways, in the three ways I've said, through how we understand power, through how we understand ourselves as who we are in terms of our identity, and also in what we regard as knowledge or important knowledge. And these things are showing up in subconsciously as well as consciously in our society.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that was very, very deep, right? Now, I'm asking this question to in the backdrop of the narrative that I sent to her. So, Commissioner, right, the narrative that I sent to her talks about the liberation movement, because Zimbabwe had its independence around 1980. 1980 is probably like 42 years from now. So there are people who participated in the liberation movement, right? The struggle, both men and women, all right? They are still alive. In terms of when we are framing legislation, national policies, and strategies, do we take into consideration this historical aspect of people who might be dealing with trauma from the colonial struggle and the liberation struggle? Do we take that into consideration when Zimbabwe is formulating national laws, policies, and strategies to address GBV?
Thank you, Prof. Thank you. In fact, since 1980, immediately after the end of the war, the government, in its wisdom, created a department specifically first to deal with war veterans, both men and women, then to deal with the war collaborators, and to deal with those who were detained, not restricted. So there is a full department for that, and it's operational. And in terms of law, it's unfortunate, offhand, I cannot say, but I understand there's a law specifically that deal with how they're supposed to be handled in terms of benefits, healthy and their well-being is also catered, both men and women. So I can safely say, yes, it's happening. And not only the liberation struggle, even post all the violence that could have happened, the victims are catered for through specific legislation. But both men and women, boys and girls, it's not selective to say you are a man and therefore you benefit. You are a woman and therefore you benefit. No, it's both men and women. That's one of the plans I have always said. We as a government, we have recognized the importance of taking gender as the framework to say when we're talking about gender, we are not talking about women only. We are talking about men and women. So when we talk about GBV, we are talking about men and women. And in this case, maybe we can be specific to say, let's look at that violence specifically pertaining to women. But in the overall context, the government is very specific that each time we are talking about gender, let's always refer to men and women, boys and girls. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Right, let's go to Caroline. Caroline, you agree with Dr. Sokoto that we need to look at the historical context of the impact of colonialism, right, and its effect, right, on gender-based violence when we are crafting our national laws, our policies and strategies. Would you agree to that?
Yes, Professor, I would agree to that, although that will not necessarily be the basis of my opinion. Well, personally, I believe that we need to, as different nations, we need to be cognizant of the international treaties we have ratified. And when we promulgate or make these national laws, we need to be aware of our international responsibilities. For instance, Lesotho has quite a number of treaties that we have ratified, but when you come to our domestic laws, you'd be surprised that we have domesticated quite a few of them. So this becomes quite problematic for a dualist state like Lesotho, because for a dualist state, international treaties do not automatically apply nationally. Before they apply nationally, our lawmaker, which is the parliament or the judiciary, they have to domesticate those international treaties and make them, local laws. For instance, now we're at the verge of having the Convention on the Elimination of Violence Against Women and Girls, the AU charter, the AU convention we are talking about. That charter, yes, Lesotho can sign it, can ratify it, but unless our lawmakers domesticate that treaty into domestic laws, I'm afraid that will just be a fruitless crusade. So like Commissioner is saying, yes, we do have to be cognizant of the cultural or the historical background that we have progressed from. And like Dr. has said, we also have to be cognizant of the psychological effect of this laws that we are continuously promulgating. But above all, we need to understand that these international treaties have to be domesticated. Our lawmakers shouldn't just enjoy going to conferences at Ethiopia and then forgetting about their treaties once they hit the local grounds. You're muted, Professor.
Let me follow up with Dr. Sokoto based on what you just said. These international laws, right, and treaties do not take into consideration the identity aspect of who we are that Dr. Sokoto raised in terms of how to address gender-based violence. Doctor, will you agree with me?
Are you talking to me?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Say that again.
Caroline was talking about we should pay more attention to international treaties, right? And I'm trying to follow back with you that most of these international treaties do not take into consideration the identity, who we are in drafting these laws. So sometimes they might not necessarily inure to our benefit in terms of looking at it from a historical context.
Yeah, and I think that's what Lerato is saying, that I like how she said that people should not just go to conferences and agree and then not contextualize the laws to meet the needs of the to address the needs of the people. And it's in my field, this is the work I do implementation science. And so one of the important things is to, a lot of times the interventions, in my case, my area of specialization is trauma. So when we are coming, the evidence-based trauma interventions and mental health interventions, most of them have been created in the West, and have been established and normalized with Western populations. So one of the reasons I'm interested in implementation science is to make sure that whenever we are doing mental health interventions in our countries, and specifically Black countries that are for majority Black people, so Caribbeans and Africans, that it is culturally relevant, and that it is relevant to the population, to the context, to what's going on, and that takes work. So to her point, it's very important that it's very important that we are able to contextualize whatever laws and whatever treaties are being put out there for us, and for us to criticize them, because that's part of the work of making them contextual. And to an extent, I don't expect international law to be able to do that work. I don't think that's on that level. I don't think that's the scope of anything that is international, anything that is global, rather global, like the even when it comes to global health. When we talk about global health policies, the expectation is not for countries to just copy and paste. It's for, we need to capture what the global health policies are just meant to inform. And then when we bring them to our countries, we have to make sure that they are implemented in a way that is palatable, accessible, and feasible to the context in which we are working with, and that requires that we rely on experts. I like that the Gender Commission has thought through in Zimbabwe what Commissioner Katsande was mentioning. It looks like, you know, there's a thought process around how to implement these policies, and by including the people that know what's going on and that have, you know, not only know what's going on, but also have whose voices are heard by the people on the ground. So like the inclusion of a community leader, I think that's those things are important in making things relevant to the people that we are trying to serve. So I think there is a place for these conferences, but I do think it's important that we make them and the reason it's important, global things are important because that's what we're doing here. We are meeting on a global platform to share ideas and to challenge each other and to learn. And then we're all going to go back to our spaces and see how the things that we have learned, you know, are relevant to the work that we are doing. So yeah, I think there's a process in implementing policies, which some of it has been highlighted by both the Commissioner and Loretta.
All right, thank you very much. Let's go to the last narrative, right, which is directed to Caroline. So I sent you the narrative, like, I just want to give you a background, right? Gender-based violence indicators study by Gender Links 2015 reported that 86% of women and 40% of men in Lesotho experience some form of violence in their lifetime, and that the majority of victims do not report the violence to the police or seek medical attention or legal recourse. Among barriers to reporting, the study identified survivor stigmatization, by the community, feelings of shame, inadequate police response to victims, and they believe that domestic violence is a private matter, not to be discussed with strangers. A study by the Commonwealth 2025 reported that about 1/3 of women in Lesotho suffer sexual or physical violence in their lifetime, and that GBV cost the country 5.5% of its gross domestic product in lost income and expenses associated with medical, legal, and police support. Now, this is the question. The government of Lesotho considered addressing GBV requires a comprehensive approach that addresses all these underlying factors: commonality, concomitantly promotes gender equality, changes harmful social norms, protects women's rights, strengthens women's economic empowerment, and ensures access to adequate services and resources for survivors. Lesotho, under the leadership of its UN resident coordinator, Ms. Amanda Kosi Makwashi, decided it was time to take bold steps. Right? The RCO Lesotho knew that this vision could not be achieved in isolation. It required a collective effort, a united front to combat GBV comprehensively. They reached out to the UN resident coordinators in Botswana, Eswatini, Namibia, South Africa, and Zambia, igniting a spark of collaboration for transformative change. Now, my question to you, despite considering GBV as a serious threat to the nation, both developmentally and economically, Lesotho does not have a national law, a policy, or strategy to addressing this threat. What could account for such anomaly within the Southern African region?
Thank you very much, Professor, for that question. Well, there are quite a number of hindrances that jeopardize us fulfilling that aspiration that we have. But to mention a few, Lesotho encounters lack of resources. Yes, we may want to implement some GBV related initiatives, but in the absence of sufficient funding, then our goals can just end up into wishful thinking. And there's a lot of our stakeholders and the government sectors are dependent on donors. So some of this donor funding comes with quite, I don't want to, I want to find a polite word, but for for a better lack of word, let me just say they come with terms that are not necessarily inclusive. Yes, we may aspire to promote the rights of women and girls, but these women and girls come from different backgrounds. If we're talking about women, we have educated women and those who are completely illiterate. We have women who live in the urban areas and women who live in the rural areas. So we cannot come up with a fits all approach. And that's the strategy that we have been implementing in recent years in Lesotho. And believe you me, we have failed tremendously because we try as much as possible to implement a one-size-fits approach, and that will always result into a disaster. It's like prescribing the same medication to different patients. And in Lesotho, another thing that is hindering our progress as far as GBV is concerned is that we have inadequate research and data collection. For instance, we rely on old studies because we don't have sufficient funding to conduct updated researches. And to echo your sentiment regarding the Commonwealth study relating to sexual offenses. Yes, sexual gender-based violence is really, really bad in Lesotho. And as a matter of fact, 44% of the Basotho male prison population comprises of those convicted for sexual offenses. 44%, that's a lot. So yes, like the UN resident coordinator said, we do need collective efforts as a nation to avoid duplication of efforts and to even amplify the efforts that we are already exerting on the ground. Thank you.
All right, let me follow up with something that you just said. Lesotho has policies on violence against women and girls, but it does not have laws, policies, and strategies on eliminating gender-based violence. Now, this goes to the initial conversation we had, that there has been some sort of isolation, right, of violence against women as more important than violence, than GBV. Because if you have the money to allocate to violence against women and girls, why can't you find the money also to deal with gender-based violence? Isn't it that isolation that we are talking about? Okay, that violence against women is a special kind of thing that we need to address. But when it comes to the other genders, they could wait all they want.
Well, I think the issue is not that of prioritization when it comes to that regard, Benjamin, but I think it's the insufficient capacity building. The insufficient capacity of our lawmakers. I wish our lawmakers were here when the commissioner explained the difference between gender-based violence and domestic violence, because some often confuse the two. And you'd be surprised when you meet a Mosotho celebrating that in Lesotho, we have laws that regulate gender-based violence, because they usually confuse gender-based violence with domestic violence. So yes, you're right. As we speak, we do not have any specific laws in Lesotho that regulate gender-based violence. However, survivors of gender-based violence find redress under different legal frameworks. For instance, we are currently celebrating Counter Domestic Violence Act as a nation, but little do we know that it only protects victims of domestic violence at the exclusion of other gender-based violence survivors who experienced GBV outside the domestic setting. So it goes to say that in order for us to fully eradicate gender-based violence, we need to provide sufficient capacity building to our lawmakers so that when they make these laws, when they attend these conferences, they have sufficient capacity to enact laws that will not only be beneficial to women and girls, but to every Mosotho and eventually to all Africans and to the whole world. I don't mean to bring a religious quote into this discussion, but there's a Bible verse that I love that said that my nation perishes because of lack of knowledge. So to be honest, Lesotho somehow, yes, I know there are other contributing factors, but somehow we are where we are today because of lack of knowledge. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. The Commissioner, listening to Caroline, right, making a submission in terms of they have laws against violence against women, but they do not have laws that address policy and structure that have addressed gender-based violence. And like we said earlier on, when I raised the issue that, right, gender-based violence has been treated, has been isolated as a special kind of victim, right? And for that matter, right, you don't have men come, because it seems like when they come to gender-based violence, mostly they see it as a woman's face. The woman's face is on it. So men do not actually want to be the advocate, even though we have some advocacy there. Is it men engaged in other stuff? Are you surprised that with all that we are doing in terms of violence against women and girls and gender-based violence, Lesotho does not have a national policy, strategy, and law against gender-based violence?
Thank you, Prof. Allow me to say, not to use the word surprised, but allow me to say, patriarchy has its way of trying to maintain power. And it does this through giving relief, say, to women in piecemeals. We have this law here or policy, but there's another law to counter that. That's exactly what I feel is happening in Lesotho. But let me bring you to Zimbabwe to say, Zimbabwe, yes, we have all these beautiful laws and policies where we are saying we understand what GBV is. And for Zimbabwe, gender-based violence, we have tried to categorize it under 4 broad main areas. To say GBV, referring to domestic violence, GBV, referring to violence against women and girls, GBV, referring to sexual harassment, and GBV, referring to also importation, harmful cultural practices. And to that end, having a good understanding of GBV, the government has enacted laws specifically targeting each area. For example, in terms of domestic violence, with the Domestic Violence Act, men and women, it criminalizes both. It's unfortunate that as a patriarchal system, some of our men will suffer in silence. But the law is very clear that if you're a man and you have been abused, you can report to the courts, and the police will take it up. In terms of violence against women, we have several acts of parliament. For example, the Marriage Act, which makes sure that no girl child is married before they reach 18 years. Even the presidential powers, which make sure that if you're a man and you want to initiate any sexual issues with a girl or a child below the age of 18, you are contacted. We have the Sexual Harassment Act. In terms of sexual harassment, is violence against women and also as GBV. The first public service, in terms of public service, that is all government workers. They are government by the Public Servants Sexual Harassment Act, which is there. And for the public, there's a specific act which also governs them. And in terms of harmful cultural practices, all these some of our practices that we do in the name of culture. We also have specific ways and policies to deal with them. And currently, our chiefs have been empowered to bring to their courts anyone who practices some of these harmful cultural practices, especially, for example, child marriages, forced virginity testing, a father-in-law having sexual intercourse with a newly married daughter-in-law, pledging the girl child to appease dead spirits, payment, where we take young girls, and if one of your family members has killed someone, you go and pay using a girl child. All these cultural practices, they have been criminalized. So, in as much as yes, we are doing our part, the implementation aspect, to me, is the one which is lacking. And definitely,
Okay.
we need to focus on that. Thank you,
All right,
Prof.
right. Thank you very much. Now, Dr. Sokoto, listening to Caroline, where she raised the issue about resources, she's saying that when they reach out to international donors, they're going to come out with so many conditions, which could be bringing in LGBTQI. They don't want to go in that direction. What role should the African diaspora play, the Lesotho African diaspora play in helping, right, deal with this resource aspect of what passing laws, legislation, and strategy to address GBV as a whole?
Yeah, this is, the example that she's given is, it goes back to how power dynamics determine the language that we use and the projects that we implement, unfortunately, because of the limited resources in developing countries. It's a constant tug of war, because European nations continue to use their money to spearhead their agendas in developing countries. It's not unique to GBV, it is general. This has been this continues to be an issue. And one of the things I love about being alive in this day and age is there is this Pan-African spirit that we have witnessed and we are witnessing across the continent around Africans are collectively coming together to exercise our agency and to exercise our agency through all these different means, whether it's through expertise, through leveraging our expertise, through leveraging our collectivity, leveraging any resources that we have access to. But essentially, the most important thing is that Africans are really coming to say that we know our problems more than anyone else, and we understand it, and we actually have ideas about how we are going to go about solving them. And we are tired of being exploited or being controlled because of money. So I really think that this is a wonderful time to be alive for any kind of issue. So in this case, we're talking about gender-based violence. And I also think that in the spirit of unity, there is a role, to your question, or for Africans in the diaspora, considering that Africans in the diaspora do have access to resources. And these resources can look different. It doesn't have to be monetary. Of course, monetary is there, but also we are in spaces where we are able to, or we have the capacity to influence a particular narrative that is African-centered. And I think that is one of the big questions that I had to contend with, and that many, and I believe any African in the diaspora, or any African academician, or any African expert in whatever field has to contend with. It's a question that Africans have posed to us, our leaders, folks like I've mentioned Ngugi wa Thiong'o, but I've also mentioned, but also we can even think about Thomas Sankara. We can also think about Michere Mugo. All these African thinkers and writers, they have always paused. What is the responsibility of being an African who is in a position of any kind of power? So whether you're an academician, whether you're an expert, and you have leverage to resources, what is your responsibility? You know, and I think it's a good question to ask, and I think it's a question for everybody to ask. And I do think that if you are in the diaspora, such as myself, one of the reasons why I just completed my PhD in psychology, and my interest is in actually participating in increasing the data, the research data that is speaking to gender-based violence and trauma in Kenya specifically, because like, I think I don't know if it's Lerato or Commissioner Katsande who talked about the lack of research studies and recent research studies to highlight the issues regarding GBV, and that also I know these research is what informs policy. So it can be very hard for policymakers to make policies that are relevant to today, you know, that are speaking to what is going on today. It's the role of researchers to be able to provide that information and to document it. And so I think there's a lot of places, a lot of gaps that Africans collectively can feel, and specifically for Africans in the diaspora, I think it's upon us to find which gap we have capacity to fill. As an academician, I can speak that one of my responsibilities, I think, is to address research gaps, and that's what my area of interest is. But I think it's a question that we all need to be continuously asking ourselves. You know, how do we participate? How do we feel? How are we feeling a gap in this conversation? I don't think there's one way to feel it, but I think that the most important is to be asking that I think it is important that every African who is outside of the continent to ask themselves, you know, how are they doing that in their own way, within their own capacity, because we also have to recognize everyone has different capacities. Just because everyone is in diaspora doesn't mean we're all in the same, you know, we're all in the same positions, or we are all in the same, or we all have the same capacity. I also think I want to just highlight the collectivity that is right now going on amongst Africans. It's a really wonderful time to be alive, where Africa is. I feel like there's a newness in the unity around all issues, gender-based violence especially. There's a unity that is going on across the continent, and it's so powerful to be able to be alive in this time and to tap into that energy in whatever way that we can.
All right. Thank you so much for that. All right. Now, let me follow up with Caroline, right? Now, what we are doing over here is trying to bridge the gap between the diaspora and the African continent. So you raised the issue about funding, right? Resources, use the word resources. I know you do a lot of advocacy for different CSO and NGOs in Lesotho. Have you tried as much as possible to reach out to the Lesotho community in the diaspora in terms of how you can collaborate with them, right? For them to bring their expertise, their knowledge, their resources together, right? To help fight this gender-based violence, or to address this gender-based violence.
Thank you very much, Professor. Yes, we try as much as possible to encourage collaboration, because we do understand that each and every one of us has a unique talent that the world needs. So if we're united in our diversity, we'll be at a better position to mobilize resources from different donors and from from different stakeholders. And once we have formed that synergy, we will not only cap duplication of efforts, but we'll also have cross-fertilization. For instance, if I were to collaborate with Dr. Sukoto, now I would have a perspective from the US, which I wouldn't have had if I was working in silos. So yes, we do try as much as possible to stimulate collaboration. And this question that you just asked me reminds me of one of the notable professors that once wrote an article on African jurisprudence where he said, "Motho ke motho ka batho," which literally translates to a person is a person because of other persons. So we need that unity. Without unity, trust me, our efforts will end up into a fruitless crusade. So let us unite and tackle gender-based violence and violence against women and girls. And while doing so, we should also explore the sphere of technologically facilitated gender-based violence, because in this era of technology, we have seen so many women being abused on the cyberspace. You know, women in politics, we see their nude pictures being shared on the internet, their revenge pornography. So we should also be cognizant of technologically facilitated gender-based violence, because it has gradually or rapidly become the new norm that should also be, featured in the Convention on Ending Violence Against Women and Girls.
All right, thank you
Thank you.
very much. Let's go to the commissioner. Commissioner, you are very fortunate that the African Union ambassador to Washington, D.C. is from Zimbabwe. So I'm assuming that there has been a lot of collaboration, right? It used to be African Aqua, now it is what? Hilda Suka. So I'm assuming that you've been having this collaboration with her being the African Union ambassador to Washington, D.C., right? In terms of how you can collaborate with the African Union and the diaspora Zimbabweans in this country. I hope you've been doing that already.
Yes, Prof. In fact, as the Zimbabwe Gender Commission, we have a department, research and programming. It collaborates not only with our local higher education institutions, but even regionally, internationally, and globally. So yes, we are doing that. And we are also working closely with our civil society organizations, with our developmental partners. And as you've hinted, the issue of the diaspora, yes, the commission is doing a lot on that part. I may not have the actual nitty-gritties as to how they're doing it, the secretariat, but I know they're doing a lot.
All right, thank you very much, Raj. So time is fast spent. Let's take a closer remark. So let's start with Caroline first. Now, as we approach February for the African Heads of State to meet in Addis Ababa to come up with a comprehensive legal framework on violence against women and girls, what are your expectations? Because it has taken them 30 years after the Beijing Declaration, right, for them to come out with it. What are your expectations? Do you think that they will be able to do that as fast as possible, or they are going to drag their feet and this thing is going to prolong?
Well, Professor, we are all no strangers to the fact that Rome was not built in a day. So, yes, ideally, I would want it to happen instantly, but in order for it to happen thoroughly and in order for us to avoid all possible loopholes, it needs to take a long period of time, because like fine wine, we need to take time to ensure that we address this issue. And in this upcoming Beijing conference, I hope that after that we will unite. We will definitely unite for the last 16 days of campaign. Theme was to unite and invest in women and girls. So I hope to see that in fruition, because a lot of things are easier said than done. So I'm hoping to see unity from different continents, and I hope that we'll finally set our differences aside, our geopolitics aside, and unite to protect women and girls. And in closing, Professor, I want to applaud you for the wonderful job that you're doing. With people like you and the job that you're doing, I honestly believe that gender-based violence will eventually be a thing of the past, because for instance, today we have learned so much from this discussion alone. So if besides that convention, we have discussions like this, then honestly speaking, gender-based violence will be nothing but history. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right, let's go to Dr. Sokoto. What are your expectations? After 30 years, the African Union is finally taking up the initiative to come up with a comprehensive legal framework. Right, we know the politics that are involved over there. What is your take in terms of they being able to, despite their differences, right? Do you think that they'll be able to come up with something very coherent, cogent when they meet?
Yeah, I think so. I think the intention to come to do this, first of all, is for me is very encouraging. And like I said, the time that we are living in is also the context, you know, the what's going on in different various African countries with relation to GBV. You know, it is especially when we don't have so much research that has been, we do have some, but we don't have as much. But the thing is that the environment and what's going on is telling us, the people are telling us that this is an important issue to them. I think it's a really important time when Africans are on the streets telling us that this is what is important to us and that we're very concerned. And so it's so good that our leaders are meeting to address these concerns, because this is very rare, where leaders are centering the people's cries a lot of times because of different reasons, and especially funding. Yeah, the people's needs are not always the center of these conversations. So I am encouraged about this meeting, and I think that as long as the people are the center of the conversation, I believe that there will be some progress, and also the involvement of experts. So I'm also very glad that these sessions, the Sankofa sessions, which has intentionally brought experts to speak on this issue, I'm glad that it will be used to inform that process. I think that's very important. So I am very I'm anticipating that it will be great. It will be fruitful. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much. Commissioner, you have the final word, right? We just finished the 16 days of what? Activism, right? Just around the corner, and we are just going into February. What are your expectations, right? Considering the fact that this is 30 years along the line, 1995 all the way to 2025, 30 years. You think that they could put away all their differences? Because we know the politics that goes on in the African Union, right? The different countries, and there are different interests, there are different religions and cultures. Are you very hopeful that after 30 years, they will come together, unite towards passing this comprehensive legal framework for us to move forward on addressing violence against women and girls?
Yes, thank you, Prof. In fact, allow me to start by saying I was very excited when I heard that it's you, a male, who is heading the dialogue concerning GBV. I was saying to myself, it's high time now we have more males engaging males in the fight for gender equality. And I was very much excited, you see, because one aspect that we are lacking in our fight, in our fight for a GBV free society is the issue of male involvement. And when males like you and me, we start talking about it, definitely we cascade the whole thing to other communities. The Prof, I was very much excited. But allow me to go back to this issue, to say, I think, yes, definitely the leaders, they're going to focus on trying to consolidate whatever gains. There may be few in some other countries, much less in some other countries, whatever gains we have made in terms of fighting GBV, they try to consolidate and try to hear from each other in terms of best practices. Then there's also need to strengthen these regional protocols. Let's strengthen them. I think definitely they'll work on that. And we come back to our own constitutions. If need to be, let's amend them. Let's have even specific, let's try to be specific when it comes to GBV issues without just being broad. You know, the language which is used in constitutions, in some cases it's very broad, in someone can go away with it. But for GBV, let's try to be very specific. But more importantly, you know, Africa, we are meeting, and we are meeting coming from various cultural practices. I know there are some who are going to refuse to sign or to put their names on particular issues, to say cultural practice does not allow that in those reservations, etc. I think such things, yes, come out, but with the political will which I expect will be coming from the leaders. Definitely, once we have the political will, some of these things that you're talking about will be forgotten about. That's my contribution, Prof. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so much. Let's say a big thank you to Loretta in Lesotho, to Commissioner Kasende in Zimbabwe, and also with Dr. Sokoto in Boston, right? Thank you for joining us today on the Sankofa African Affairs webinar organized by Ben Associate Consulting Limited. We hope to come to you next week Friday, as we continue our discussions on gender-based violence as we approach the African Union Heads of State World Convention in Addis Ababa. So on this note, I said thank you and enjoy the rest of your weekend. If you have any issues, I can help you connect with the ambassador. I've had communication with the ambassador. She was supposed to join us this morning, but she has had some engagement, so she will not be available. So if you want me to link you, I'll be willing to do that for you to have a conversation with her, especially on this issue. She considers this issue very, very important to herself. So I'll be able to link you up. I mean, the African Union ambassador to Washington, D.C., who is from Zimbabwe. So on this note, I say thank you all and enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Thank you, Prof.
Thank you, Professor. Bye.
Bye.
Asante.
Thank you, Professor. Bye-bye.